In this video I will continue to comment the preface to the first edition of the Wissenschaft der Logik. I have this German edition and also with me the Science of Logic in English. And I believe that in order to understand Hegel's logic, one has to read the German edition, but I understand that not everyone can speak German. So for the non-essential parts, it's okay to read the English version, and since it's just a preface, there are no technical words, so I will read mostly the English translation. And I will comment each sentence, and I recommend that you should watch the first video, the fröhliche Wissenschaft der Logik. I'll put the link down below, and also I made a playlist, Wissenschaft der Logik. If you are interested, I recommend that you should watch the videos to try to understand what I mean. So I stopped in my previous video about the preface at the end of the first 4 lines, so I continue. What was hitherto called metaphysics has been, so to speak, extirpated root and branch and has vanished from the ranks of the sciences. So what Hegel means from a historical perspective is that metaphysics has been brought down by Kant. To simplify to the utmost, Kant tried to prove that we could not know what the objects of metaphysics are, being, God, the soul, the world, because the faculties of our mind, what he calls the transcendental ego, were limited, and we were only capable of grasping finite objects. And to simplify to the utmost, Kant, although he wanted to save metaphysics by proving the limitations of our own faculty of knowing the truth, he kind of brought the downfall of metaphysics. And to simplify, in the history of the West, it is widely believed that metaphysics has been killed, so to speak, by Kant. And since Kant, metaphysics has become useless, so to speak. So in a historical context, Hegel was aware of that, and he was trying to bring forth the rebirth, or to the completion, the achievement of metaphysics. And what is metaphysics? People ordinarily believe that metaphysics is some sort of boring, armchair theorizing about fictional entities, a waste of time, which has no purpose, no interest, only for the crazy philosophers who are parasites living off society's real working capabilities. There's a part of truth in that, but what people do not understand is that metaphysics is the Greek word for that which in Latin corresponds to supernatural. Metaphysical means supernatural, that which is above nature. And in our day and age, people are fascinated by the supernatural in TV shows, novels, video games, stories. People are interested in supernatural entities, fairies, vampires, dragons, witches, extraterrestrials, ghosts, and stuff of all sorts. But what they do not understand is that these entities are supernatural, therefore they are metaphysical. So Hegel's metaphysics, which is logic, we'll see that later, enables us to understand these supernatural entities. So yeah. And he asked himself, where are the voices still to be heard of the ontology of former times, of the rational psychology, the cosmology, or indeed even of the natural theology of the past? Or where are they allowed to be heard? So ontology, if you wonder what is ontology, ontology is the theory of being. What is being? When we say that something is, it's an ontological question. What does it mean to say that something is or is not? To say that something exists or does not exist? That something is real or not real? These are ontological questions. What is a thing? And ontology is at the basis of everything else, because if you say, is there a God? Does God exist? What is God? These are ontological questions. So before answering the question of what God is, one has to answer the question, what is being? What does the word is mean? What do we mean when we say that something is? That's ontology. Then, rational psychology. There are people today who question, and like always, I guess, do we have a soul? What is the soul? Do we have a soul within our body? What are the faculties of the soul? Can the soul leave the body? Where will the soul go after the body dies? Is the soul immortal, immaterial, eternal? These are the kind of questions that religious people ask themselves, but what they don't realize is that these are the questions that the metaphysicians in the Western tradition have spent officially the past 25 centuries trying to answer. And I know that in today's West, in the right-wing pagan communities, people are wondering themselves questions about the soul and the immortality of the soul. But these kind of questions have been thought about by the greatest thinking geniuses ever. So, yeah. Then cosmology, it's the theory of the world as a unified totality. And in our day and age, cosmology is the realm of theoretical physicists. But the difference between a metaphysical view of cosmology and an empirical view is that the empiricists, namely the modern physicists, need proofs and experiences and observation in order to validate their postulates and their ideas, whereas the metaphysician thinks about the world strictly from logical and thought categories. But eventually, empiricism and a priori thinking must coincide. This is the view of Hegel. And natural theology, when people ask themselves questions about God, is there a God? What is God? Who is God? Can we know God? These kind of questions have been thought about by the metaphysicians, and Hegel's logic is, in his own word, the presentation of the mind of God in his eternal essence. So if one wants to know God, one has to study metaphysics and logic, and I will show later that they coincide for Hegel. Then he talks about inquiries, for instance, into the immateriality of the soul, that's I just mentioned, or into mechanical and final causes. This is very interesting because I will illustrate with the example of Spinoza and Ludwig von Mises. In the history of thought, Spinoza emerges in the 17th century after the development of Galilean physics, Cartesian mechanics, and the development of thought in the Western world was the idea that the world was some sort of a mechanism, and that everything in the realm of nature occurred according to a set of regulated laws, that the world was a rational process, a blind mechanical process. And in this context, Spinoza emerges and he takes this mechanistic view to its logical conclusion, but not to bring about a mechanistic view of the world, but a speculative, mystical view of God. But in the view of Spinoza, everything occurs because of efficient causes. Namely, every event is caused by the event that came before, and the event that came before itself is caused by the event that came before, etc., etc. Ad infinitum, if you regress to the cause of the cause of the cause, you end up thinking about the cause of itself, the causa sui, which is a cause without a cause, which is God. And for Spinoza, this cause, which is self-caused, cause of itself, is God, and it is the only free agent, and everything else is an effect of God, a consequence of God, one might say. And Spinoza did not envision any end purpose. So for him, God, the first agent, the cause of itself, was acting blindly, so to speak. It was just a cause which produced effects, but with no end goal, with no aim, with no intention, with no target. And the question of, is there an end goal? Is God or nature or the universe aiming, or mankind aiming at something, targeting an objective, a point? This is a metaphysical question. And just to illustrate, it is widely believed by modern physicists and biologists and chemists that the world is purposeless, that the universe exists by accident, that it could have not existed, and it's just blind necessity. As Richard Dawkins says, the blind watchmaker. So for the modern atheistic rationalist mind, the universe is some sort of an accident. It exists, but with no purpose. And Ludwig von Mises, the economist, the Jewish praxeologist, in his very famous book Human Action, he developed the idea that the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, and the social sciences should be epistemologically distinguished, because he acknowledges that in the realm of nature there is no purpose. In his view, there is no end goal, there is no teleology, there is no action with an aim in mind. But he says that with the appearance of man, man can act purposefully. This is what he calls human action, the idea that man, through his mind, can set himself goals and targets, and to envision an objective, and to bring forth by his action, by his will, by his activity, the realization of a plan, of a goal, of a motive, of a will. So he acknowledges that there's a radical epistemological, which means the theory of knowledge, a radical epistemological breaking up by the appearance of man, and that man and everything which consequently follows from human activity, like all the social sciences, must be distinguished from the natural sciences. So Spinoza would say that even when we think that we act purposefully, we are blinding ourselves and we are deluding ourselves. But we have the very strong illusion that we act purposefully. We have the belief, maybe it's a delusion, but that we act with an intention. So the illusion exists. So nature, from an historical, cosmological, Darwinian perspective, nature produces in man the illusion of purposeful activity. So these are the kind of questions which have been debated by metaphysicians, and Hegel discusses these kind of questions. The fact is that interest, whether in the content or in the form of the former metaphysics, or in both together, has been lost. And it was true in the context of the historical appearance of the science of logic in the beginning of the 19th century, and it is true today in the West. Today, very few scholars are interested in metaphysics. They say that's a waste of time. If you're smart, if you're gifted, you should do physics or politics to manipulate the people and to steal their money, so to speak. He says it is remarkable when a people loses its metaphysics, when the spirit engaged with its pure essence, the contemplation and the consideration, the thinking consideration of its own essence, no longer has any real presence in its life. So Hegel was amazed by the fact that at the end of 19th century Germany, although there were metaphysicians like Schelling and Fichte and in the Romantic circles, but the Kantian moment had disrupted and kind of killed metaphysics, and Hegel wanted to bring metaphysics back to life. And in the modern West, there are still metaphysicians in some obscure office of academia, but most of the philosophers are not really metaphysicians. They talk about metaphysics as some sort of an embarrassment in Western thought, that now we have become rationalists, we have modern science and stuff like that. But yeah. Now, and about the history of philosophy. The history of philosophy, since the death of the historical Hegel, which is dubious, but let us assume that it was true, is nothing but an attempt to finish what Kant had started, namely to achieve, achieve in French it means achever, it means to put to death, to put to death metaphysics. Marx wanted to bring about the end of metaphysics. Nietzsche, Freud, the analytical philosopher, the deconstructionist, the positivist in the 19th century, every major school of philosophy, with the exception of a few isolated schools, but most of the historical schools of philosophy for the past 200 years have attempted to negate metaphysics, which was already in a state of coma and almost dead. So, yeah. Yeah. Then he says, the exoteric teaching of the Kantian philosophy, that the understanding, which is the Kantian mind, the table of the categories, the categorical thinking, the mind, which is not the empirical psychological mind, it is the transcendental ego, which thinks through the use of category, which organizes the perception and the experience of the world by using the categories of quality, quantity, modality, relation, unity, plurality, totality, substance, cause, accident, and stuff like that. You can find this in the Kritik der reinen Vernunft. This is the idea of Kant, that we as thinking beings have a transcendental self which structures, shapes, organizes our perception of the world. This is an immaterial self. It is not our psychological individuality. It has nothing to do with our memory, our history, our tastes, our wickedness. It's a pure thought which exists in our mind, which is our mind, so to speak. This is the understanding. So the understanding ought not to be allowed to soar above experience. Experience is that which is validated by the senses, that which can be checked, verified, observed, noticed, measured, quantified, seen, even with a microscope or a telescope. But experience, in this sense, is that which is made present through the senses. Even if we use instruments to increase the capability of our senses, like microscopes or telescopes, it is still within the realm of experience. So the idea of Kant was that the understanding should, the thinking capability of man should be validated by the validation, the observation of experience. And this is the mindset of all our scientists today. They say that if you have a theory which cannot be proven by experience, it's just a theory and it's worthless. And only the facts should validate whether your theory is true or not. This is difficult for every scientist, because you can spend years, a decade, elaborating a complex theory, and if it's not in accordance with the observation of the facts in the realm of physics, your theory falls apart, so to speak. The understanding ought not to be allowed to soar above experience, lest the cognitive faculty become a theoretical reason that by itself would beget nothing but mental fancies. I will read the German, the German word. In the German edition, they say, dass der Verstand die Erfahrung nicht überfliegen dürfe, sonst werde das Erkenntnisvermögen theoretisch Vernunft, welche für sich nichts als Hirngespinste gebäre. The French translation is chimera. A chimera is a mythological creature, a mixture of a lion, a goat, and a snake. That's probably the image that I have chosen to illustrate this video. So the idea in the French translation is that if reason elevates itself above the experience, it gives birth to monsters, basically, to fantastical creatures. And Hegel says that we should elevate ourselves beyond experience. He says that with science and common sense, thus working hand in hand to cause the downfall of metaphysics, we had, in his historical context, but it is still true today, the singular spectacle came into view of a cultivated people without metaphysics. And here, whenever Hegel talks about science, Wissenschaft in German, he doesn't mean what we call science. What we call science is what Hegel calls the empirical sciences, And what he calls Wissenschaft and science is speculative, mystical knowledge of the divine. So for him, philosophy, because the business of philosophy is the knowledge of God, in his view, science means, for him, Kant was a scientist, but some sort of a renegade, because although he was a philosopher, he worked against the knowledge that philosophy is supposed to bring about, namely the knowledge of God. So in the view of Hegel, Kant was a renegade. Yeah. And in the view of Kant, if Kant could think about Hegel, he would say that Hegel was a delirious, insane mind. Both may be true. Yeah. So, yeah, the singular spectacle came into view of a cultivated people without metaphysics. And in the world today, the Europeans, if I'm honest, are the most, historically, the most cultivated people. European culture is the most refined, most complex, most wealthy, richest, most profound culture of any people. And modern Europeans, and it is true of whites outside of Europe, Americans, etc., have no metaphysics. That's strange, but I have noted that it is part of Western European and German metaphysics to negate itself. So the downfall of metaphysics, as will be shown later, is a moment in the development, the process, and the unfolding of German and Western and European metaphysics itself. So the fundamental determination of German metaphysics is that it contains within itself the negation of itself. That's important. And yeah, I continue. Theology, which in former times was the custodian of the speculative mysteries. Mystery comes from a Greek word which is mystes, which means the initiated. And what is mysterious is often mystical, namely it has to be understood by a speculative grasping, and only the initiated can understand the mysteries and what is mystical. And Hegel says in the Encyclopedia that whatever we call mystical is what he calls speculative. So speculative logic, speculative thinking is mystical thinking, divine thinking. Yeah. Then he talks about those solitary individuals whom their people had exiled from the world and dedicated to the contemplation of the eternal also disappeared. Theirs was a life devoted exclusively to the service of contemplation, without practical gain, but only for the sake of blessedness. So, in our world today, I guess that there are still solitary individuals who devote their entire life to the contemplation of the absolute, or God, or the divine, or the nothing, or the void, or whatever. I know that there are relatively many people, solitary, contemplative minds in the eastern part of the world, in India, Tibet, maybe China. It's a very Eastern thing, the idea to negate life, basically, to live the minimum, and to devote your entire life to the contemplation of the divine, basically. That's a very Eastern thing to do. And we still have individuals like this in our world. Then he talks about logic. Logic did not fare quite as badly as metaphysics. Here he will talk about the distinction between logic and metaphysics. That from logic one learns how to think. Logic is the doctrine the theory, the science eventually, which teaches us how to think, which for lack of anything else was considered its usefulness and therefore its purpose, just as if one were to learn how to digest or to move first from the study of anatomy and physiology. This is a very important passage, and I will comment. Logic is the science of thought. If I had to illustrate, I would say, maybe I'm wrong, but that's how I envision things. Logic, as a theory, is to thought, the activity of thinking, what grammar is to language. We can speak without knowing grammar. I mean, except the grammarians, 99.9% of people speak ordinary language without knowing the totality of all the rules, determinations, complexities of the grammar. Only the specialists do. And every thinking mind thinks constantly without knowing the rules of logic. And the question is, why should we study logic? What is the purpose? What is the use? And ordinary human beings can digest edible food, and non-edible food also, and ordinary human beings can walk and run, and they do not have to study anatomy or physiology to know how to digest or to run or to walk. But if you have problems of digestion, you should go to the doctor, and the doctor knows anatomy and physiology. And if you are a sportsman, an athlete, and if you want to perform as a basketball player, as a runner, as a marathon runner, as any sports, any activity, a tennisman, whatever, you should study, not you individually, but you should work with experts who know about anatomy and physiology and how to enhance the faculties of your body if you want to perform at the highest stages of the Olympic Games or competition in the NBA, in the NFL, in the Champions League in Europe, whatever. If you want to be at the top in sports, you have to have a knowledge, directly or indirectly, of anatomy and physiology to enhance the faculties of your body. And this is the same with logic. If you want to think correctly, if you want to have great thoughts, if you want to understand yourself and the world and God, you have to study logic eventually. That's the purpose of logic. So why should we bother studying logic? For the very reason that I have just explained. If you want to be the best, or if you want to be at the top in your field of endeavor, you have to exert and to study and to work and to focus. So, yeah. Nevertheless, probably for the sake of a certain formal utility, a place was still allowed for it among the sciences. It was even retained as a subject of public instruction. He talks about logic. However, this better lot concerns only the outer fate of logic, for its shape and content have remained the same throughout a long inherited tradition. What I can say about this? There are very few people quantitatively who know about logic, like there are very few people who know about grammar. I mean, the basic rules of grammar, but except the grammarians and the logicians, most people live and think without knowing grammar and logic except empirically and what I've been taught in school. But I have noticed that the greatest books in any topic, whatever the theme, whatever the topic, whatever the subject of the book, be it physics, chemistry, economics, sociology, whatever, the best books are those who are the most logically structured. So even if their authors, physicists, economists, whatever, may not have a fully conceptual knowledge of logic, they have a very logical mind and they structure their thoughts according to a logical process. And the more you read abstract theoretical books, the more you stumble upon the categories, or what Hegel calls die Reflexionsbestimmungen, like identity, difference, ground, consequence, universal, particular, identity, difference, I said, cause, effect, substance, accidents, positive, negative, all the categories which are presented in Hegelian logic in their pure abstraction with no sensuous presence. These logical categories are used by everyone, but the more abstract and theoretical the book, and the most abstract and theoretical books are the best, because they enable to have a greater understanding of a more vast, of a wider range of objects. So the more you elevate yourself in thought, the more you encounter these logical categories which will be developed in Hegel's logic. So yeah. And he says that the content of logic in a historical context, which is Aristotelian logic, but just to illustrate, Plato in his dialogues and Socrates, they already used logic, but without consciously thinking about the structure of logic. It is Aristotle which extracted logic for itself in its pure thinking capability. He thought about logic independently of the use of logic. So that's self-reflective thought. So Aristotle was not dumb, if I might say. He might even have been smart, I guess. And so Hegel complained because logic from the time of Aristotle, which is basically the 4th century BCE up until the 18th century, so for more than 2,000 years, had remained broadly the same. And it is a great credit given to Aristotle, the fact that his theory of logic has survived the times for 2,000 years with modifications, adjustments, changes, but the overall structure was correct. So Aristotle extracted the truth about classical logic in the sense that for 2,000 years, broadly, the fundamental structure, although it has been modified and changed, etc., the key elements, the essential elements, remained stable. And Hegel praised Aristotle, but he said, if this thread of logic has been broadly identical in its fundamental determination for such a long time, maybe it needs to be shaken up, to be reshaped, to be restructured. So Hegel is the mind who wanted to restructure logic, to restructure thought itself. So that's a revolutionary act. Yeah. I finish with the last sentence. However, once the substantial form of the spirit has reconstituted itself, it is of no avail to want to retain the forms of an earlier culture. These are like withered leaves pushed aside by the new buds already being generated at their roots. That's Hegel being poetical. It doesn't happen very often, but sometimes he goes on a poetic expression. And I made a video today about the phenomenology of mind and spirit, and there's the metaphor, the illustration of the bud and the flower and the fruit and the blossom. You can watch my videos about the phenomenology of mind. But in the context, in the historical context of the birth, so to speak, of the science of logic, I made a video, the first part, in which I explain spirit becoming conscious of itself through Schelling and Fichte and the Romantic movement. And Hegel says that because spirit has acquired such a new consciousness of himself or of itself, every mode of expression of spirit must be reshaped, and eventually logic itself, which is the highest determination of thought, which is thought itself. So this is the reason why logic is in need, in the time of Hegel, from a historical perspective, was in need of a reshaping. And in our day and age, there is the birth of a spiritual community in the right-wing pagan sphere as of now, but in the world at large eventually. And these people are rediscovering their artistic cultural and religious and spiritual identity, but what they need and what hopefully I can provide them with, or me or Hegel or whoever, is a metaphysical and logical perspective. And it will be shown later that metaphysics and logic coincide eventually. And that's what I had to say. So I commented in my first systematic comment of the Wissenschaft der Logik, I commented the first 4 lines. And now in the preface to the first edition, I have commented the first 2 pages. And maybe I will continue. There are still 2.5 pages. I don't know if I will continue or when, but that's the plan. So that's what I had to say.